I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we look at the latest updates from Ukraine, discuss Russia's re-entry into the grain deal, and we analyse the impact of the war on the energy security and resilience of Europe and Russia.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Ukraine can win, Ukraine must win, and Ukraine will win.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Wednesday, the 2nd of November, day 252. And today, I'm joined by Associate Editor Dominic Nichols and our guest, Dionis Cenusa. Dionis is a risk analyst based in Germany and associated with the Eastern European Studies Centre in Vilnius. His research and writing looks at energy security and state resilience with a focus on Eastern Europe and Russia. Dom, can I start with you? What's the latest from Ukraine?
Well, hi David, good afternoon everybody. Another busy night last night for Ukrainian air defence. The Ukrainian Air Force said that they shot down 12 of 13 Iranian made Shahed 136 drones fired at the country, launched by Russia. 6 each shot down in the eastern and central regions of the country. The Air Force said this brings to the total number of these 136 drones shot down to more than 300 since February the 24th. Now, Iran continues to deny supplying Russia with these weapons, but President Zelensky has said he believes that Russia has ordered, not necessarily taken delivery of, but ordered as many as 2,500 or 2,400 to be precise, with the aim of attacking critical infrastructure. I mean, these are low, slow and noisy, which is largely why they are able to be hit by air defence. But if those air defence assets are primarily located around military areas, headquarters, critical logistic nodes, for example, then the areas of civilian national infrastructure are necessarily less protected because there are so many of them across a very large country. And that is what Ukraine say that Russia is targeting. I think the evidence for that is fairly incontrovertible. That's what we've seen in the last few weeks. That's the shift of this war away from attacking military targets or any dare I say it, sort of civilian areas of direct military relevance. They're just going for Ukraine's national infrastructure in order to try and freeze them out over the winter to come. But that was the message last night from the Ukrainian Air Force. Separately, the grain deal is back on. So the deal brokered by the United Nations and Turkey to get grain supplies out of Ukraine for their export across the world had been postponed after Russia walked out of the deal at the weekend. But this morning, Russia's MOD, their Ministry of Defence, said that the deal is back on. Again, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey, sort of instrumental here in getting this going. A guy who's actually been able to, not keep a foot in both camps. That's too strong. But he's able to speak to both Ukraine and Putin. So he was able to broker this deal. But Russia's defence ministry said, quote, "We have managed." I'm sorry, I should go back a step. I'm interested in how they're trying to frame this, or how they are framing this narrative. So they said, quote, "We have managed to secure the necessary written guarantees from Ukraine that the humanitarian corridor and the Ukrainian ports designated for the supplies will not be used for waging hostilities against Russia. Russia believes that the guarantees appear to be sufficient at this point, and it is resuming the implementation of the agreement," unquote. Now, President Zelensky has said, he said yesterday that these corridors need a proper, reliable, long-term protection. Otherwise, we're just going to stumble from one crisis to another here. Because I think what's happening here is that Russia are attempting to say to those countries around the world who don't follow the Ukraine war, day to day. It feels somewhat distant to them, but they obviously get a vote in the UN General Assembly and therefore are important to court. They are affected, very heavily affected by these grain supplies. And I think what Russia's trying to do is to say that any interruption to your grain supply is because of Ukrainian action, their military actions, nothing to do with us. We're doing everything we can to get these out, to the extent that they've needed written guarantees from Ukraine that the humanitarian corridor will not be used for waging hostilities against Russia. And importantly, the Ukrainian ports designated for their supplies will not be used for waging hostilities against Russia. So I think they're leaving themselves wiggle room there in the future to take some sort of punitive action if they wish, to say that, well, Ukrainian Navy or Ukrainian anti-ship missiles were fired from this port that's used for humanitarian supplies, etc., etc., etc. We've seen them set up these narratives before, so I think it's important to note that great, the grain deal is back on, but Russia, this is one of the few cards they have. They're maximising the opportunity they have to not only control this the provision of grain in a bid to appeal to, like I say, those votes around the world who care more about the grain than the actual what's going on in the war itself, and they're taking every opportunity to frame the narrative in that regard. Just got one more point, but I'll take a little break there and let you come back, David.
Thanks, Dom. Yeah, I just wanted to ask, when you're looking over the events at the front across Ukraine, we've had the speedy counterattack in Kharkiv in September, and we know that the Russians are fortifying the southern city of Kherson against what we believe is an impending Ukrainian assault. I just wondered if you had any comment on whether you think that activities are starting to slow down militarily as winter approaches, or is that completely incorrect?
No, not completely incorrect. I mean, it depends what you mean by slow down. Certainly the lines, the actual front line, if you like, going to draw a line on the map, they are starting to solidify as winter approaches. There may well be one more big chapter to be written this year around Kherson. Quite what that will be, will play out in the next few weeks. But I think that the lines are largely freezing in. That's not to say that there's not a lot going on. I mean, there's still a huge amount of artillery being fired at this area and elsewhere across the country, obviously. But along the front line, I mean, I've been looking at the stats. Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs say this morning that there are over 70,000. I think it was over 73,000 Russian dead, KIA, killed in action, Russian soldiers. And as we say, you should multiply that by at least 3, if not 4, to get the number of wounded as well, which takes you up to the circa 180,000-ish that we believe Russia went over the border with on February the 24th. Now, that might be one of the reasons why everything's slowed down, is because there's just simply not the people there. Russia don't have these people. What they do have is newly mobilised and recently mobilised people that have gone in very poorly trained and equipped and led, but they are there in mass, and the Russian army don't, as we've seen, they don't care about the casualties. They just want to push people forward to kind of keep those lines moving. So they are not afraid to just use people up to try and push those lines. Ukraine, albeit better equipped, trained and led, are much fewer in number, and they're much more careful about how they risk their very valuable personnel. I mean, there's been great support from external partners, NATO, other partners in the West, other partners around the world, in terms of provision of material and provision of financial and diplomatic support. But as has been made very clear, the one thing they're not going to do is put boots on the ground. So for all that assistance, Ukraine, in terms of the fighters, they've got what they've got. That's it. They said earlier on in the war that if they went for full mobilisation, they've got a huge number. I think they put the figure on something like 700,000 men of fighting age. That must be men and women of fighting age, but which is a huge number. But I mean, they're not there yet. They haven't gone for that step. So they are much fewer in number, albeit better led, trained and equipped. But they are loath to risk that against this mass of mobilised people on the Russian side. So that, I think that's why the lines aren't moving a great deal. Ministry of Foreign Affairs saying that, like I say, over 70,000 dead so far. I mean, those numbers are ticking up. I've been watching it the last few days, ticking up by, in the hundreds, 500, 600, 700 a day, which is a huge number. Take it all with pinch of salt-ish. You've got to be skeptical about figures, skeptical about all the information sources that you get, because it is so difficult to get real ground truth in any war, especially this one. But that is a huge number. Now, it could be accurate because the Russian personnel there on the front at the moment are not the people that went rolled over on the border on February the 24th. So they're not that well trained. They probably are more susceptible to the fire coming at them from Ukraine. But it's still a hell of a number, 500 or 600, 700 dead a day. But yeah, I think those lines are largely freezing in for the winter. Brackets, let's keep our eye on Kherson in the south.
Well, thank you very much for that, Dom. Dionis, can I come to you? Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us. We're really, really interested in what you have to say about energy security. First of all, would you just introduce yourself and let our listeners know where you are and what kind of things you're looking at?
Thank you, David. Hi, everyone. I hope that you can hear me well. Well, as you mentioned, I'm based in Germany, and since the war started, I have actually switched my research in a way and started to look closely to what Russia does in Ukraine, using its military capabilities to actually undermine the independence and territorial integrity of this country. But at the same time, using, let's say, a more sophisticated set of tools in order to achieve its goals. Of course, we have seen that Ukraine has shown great resilience against the Russian aggression, including in what we know as energy security. But that happens and has been happening due to the large support coming from the EU, and in addition to that, also the abilities of Ukrainians to advance certain energy projects, like the joining of the European electricity grid. But maybe you have more specific questions, because I think that the discussion is about the current situation, and I think that there is a lot to talk about that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for that overview, Dionis. Just quickly, I just wondered your reaction to the news that Russia is re-entering the grain deal. I know you've been looking at this in part of your thinking about regional security. What's your take on that?
Well, I agree with what Dom has mentioned. In many regards, we are witnessing an attempt of Russia to use different narratives that put Russia in an advantageous position in terms of shaping a certain topic for the global South. Because I believe that we don't talk about Russia trying to persuade the Europeans, where the communication or the access to credible media is still in a good shape. We are dealing with the disinformation that Russia is using to influence those who are depending on grains coming from Ukraine, those who feel the food security to a different level than we are doing here in Europe. So this specific move of Russia has been decided exactly from this point of view, to influence the narrative, and at the same time to add to other several narratives that are going on in parallel. And we have seen how Russia has been promoting the so-called conversation about dirty bomb, and then now they are again talking about the tactical use of nukes against Ukraine. So they try to make first of all their own public at home discussing how Russia can strike against Ukraine, but at the same time to increase the pressure on the international community, especially in the global South, about the necessity of having negotiations between Ukraine and Russia.
Well, thanks very much. Let's get into your work. You write about regional security and energy security. Can I ask, how are these interlinked in Russia and Ukraine? Can you give us a bit of an overview of these factors in both countries?
Well, Russia has been very agile in using the dependencies of other countries on the exports of Russian gas primarily. And as we all know, Ukraine is an important transit country through which Russia has been supplying gas to Europe. Many things have happened since the beginning of this year, especially in the last couple of months. And it's important to mention that Russia was already targeting to reduce the supply of gas through Ukraine last year when we have registered 25% of decrease of gas sent to Europe through Ukraine. But this was only the beginning. What we have seen this year is that this is not just the it's not the current object of Russia. It tries to rather destroy, on the one hand, the critical infrastructure of Ukraine, primarily that which is responsible for producing electricity, and this is important in order to break the resilience of the Ukrainians during the current Russian aggression, but at the same time to increase the cost that lies on the Ukrainian budget, because we know that Ukraine is in need for external assistance. So targeting the critical infrastructure of Ukraine right now is important in order to carry out this war of attrition against the Ukrainian state, as well as to increase the cost of the war for Ukraine, but also for those who are supporting Ukraine against Russian aggression. So therefore, for Russia now, the target is not to destroy the pipelines that are exporting Russian gas through Ukraine, but rather to focus on other issues that are reducing the capacity of Ukraine to survive the Russian aggression. And when it comes to other important elements of Russian energy leverage on Europe, we have also noticed that Russia is really losing very quickly what we knew as European dependence on Russia. We know that the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 are not functional because of the explosions that we understand Russia is involved in. Then we also have the decision of Russia to hold the export of gas to different EU countries because of the sanctions, as Russia is saying, and only Hungary right now is receiving gas from Russia, but not through Ukraine, but rather from the Turkish stream. So there is a lot of things going on, and Russia is trying to adjust to the new energy reality in Europe, which is importing more through LNG and is increasing the energy ties with Northern Africa, and also is looking for ways to reduce the energy consumption for the European economies.
Thank you very much. Can we flip the question around a little bit? So we've looked at Russia, and that was a great overview. Can you explain the Ukrainian position now, Ukrainian energy resilience, and give our listeners a sense of where Ukraine gets its energy from, what the grid looks like? I think that's potentially something we've been missing in the conversation so far.
Well, the Russians have been targeting various elements of energy critical infrastructure. We know that more than 40 of such elements have been targeted successfully by the Russian missiles, as well as the Iranian kamikaze drones. And I think that this is just the beginning, because what we know is that Russia needs to produce as much damage as it can before the temperatures Ukrainians are going to do with the refugees that potentially could return from Ukraine or come in bigger numbers. So we don't talk only about how the Ukrainian state can survive during the winter, but also how the pressure of pushing the Ukrainians away from Ukraine can actually influence the political decisions in the EU and among the EU member states. So therefore, it's important to understand how we can help the Ukrainians to actually protect their critical infrastructure. And in this regard, I remember that the NATO member states have discussed at the beginning of October about reshifting their attention to the protection, to the air protection support for Ukraine, and I think that this will be one of the priorities of the upcoming external assistance coming to or going to Ukraine. And more than that, we also know that the Ukrainians are in the position of reducing the consumption of gas, because first of all, the war has been affecting the domestic production of gas, which in Ukraine was was an important source of energy security. Right now, the gas storage of the country is filled with 13 billion cubic meters, which is about 70% of the volumes of the last year. So we might have also problems with supplying the Ukrainian population and the business, which is still running in Ukraine, with energy in order to function properly and be actually resilient towards or against the Russian aggression.
Dionis, in one of your recent articles, you talked about how Ukraine, you've just touched on it, is attempting to import energy. You mentioned the synchronization of transmission networks that was attempted in March. I think this podcast is a good place to go into the details a little bit. So can you explain to our listeners what they tried to do? What does synchronization of transmission networks mean? Why did they have to do it? And was it successful?
Yes, I think that this was a very important step in order to create alternative creates routes for alternative imports of power from the EU countries, which form the EU power grid. And recently, the conversations that the Ukrainians have been holding with the EU counterparts were about importing electricity from Slovakia. So the synchronization with the EU transmission, power transmission and grid is important specifically for security reasons, because if the country like Ukraine or Moldova are not able to produce electricity from their own capacities, then they can rely on imports from the EU. The only aspect which can be sensitive, especially given the financial situation of Ukraine, but also of Moldova, which is part of this package of synchronization that took place in March this year, is that the costs are higher than those for Ukraine and Moldova than those that could be secured through the internal production. Which means that even if Ukraine is able to import these alternative sources of energy, it is still very important to give Ukrainians financial support in order to pay for this more expensive electricity. So this is the sensitive part of the issue. But when it comes to security, then as it was happening with the reverse of the gas supply that Ukraine has developed in the last few years, importing a lot of gas from Slovakia, Hungary, and other countries, and no gas from Russia. The same principle goes for electricity. Now Ukraine can do that in order to ensure the minimum necessity of electricity, again, in order to provide the population with the public services such as heating and other vital services that the state is obliged in a way to provide its population with.
So synchronization, just to be clear, does that mean that they were adjusting the ability of the Ukrainian electricity grid to receive imports of European energy? I just want to be clear about sort of the details of what that actually means.
Yes, you're right. This is about technical issues, and it was about the adjustments at the technical level between the grids of Ukraine and the European ones, which were not working at the same, or using the same standards. So now the standards are uniform, and this import and export both from Ukraine and from the EU is technically possible. And this plan was prepared for some time, and if not the war, then it was scheduled for the next 2 years. So the beginning of the war has been also very important and had a transformative role for this energy interdependence and interconnection between Ukraine, Moldova, and the European Union.
Thank you very much for explaining that. Can we talk a little bit about Moldova? You've mentioned the country a few times. This is Ukraine's western neighbour. How has the conflict and energy security impacted Moldova in the past few months?
Well, because we are dealing with highly interdependent systems when we talk about energy and electricity or gas supply, Moldova is very much a victim, a collateral victim of what Russia is doing to Ukraine. So when Ukraine has been forced to reduce the volumes of gas through one of the entry points, then this also affected the volumes that went to Moldova. Right now, when Russian missiles started to strike the critical infrastructure of Ukraine that is producing electricity, Ukraine has been forced to stop the export of its electricity to Moldova. Moldova has been buying about 30% of the imported electricity from Ukraine. And therefore, for Moldova, it's also important to have this ability to import from the EU grid, which is or has become a reality after synchronization that took place simultaneously with Ukraine. So both Ukraine and Moldova now are somehow under the protection, under the umbrella of the EU when it comes to exports or imports, both of electricity and natural gas.
Thank you very much. I know that Dom has been listening. Dom, you have a question for Dionis. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks, David. Hi, Dionis. Lovely to have you with us. Just wondered if you could give us your opinion, please, from a risk practitioner's perspective of the unexpected, or maybe not unexpected, but the much more rapid move away from fossil fuels and Russian oil and gas in particular that Europe, the stance that Europe is now taking. What is it going to have any impact because of the sort of lurch away that was been precipitated by the war?
Yes, you are in a way right, though we need to also consider the fact that with the high prices for oil, and how it affects the affordability of prices for the consumers, the states, especially in the Western Hemisphere, are obliged or feel the necessity to offer subsidies to the businesses and to try to help the population, the most vulnerable, with compensation schemes, which in a way takes away money that could go for the green transition. So from this point of view, the Russian war has a detrimental consequence. But on the other hand, we see that the EU decision makers are understanding the importance of making the transition as quick as possible in order to reduce the dependency that the West had on petrostates like Russia. So it's clear now that the EU should, or even the US, which is going to throw a lot of money in order to increase the production of clean energy, that they need to make sure that what happened in 2022 is not going to repeat anytime soon, which means that Russia should not be allowed to have the capacities to weaponize the energy and to weaponize the gas dependency of the West. Of course, even if the EU is buying much less gas from Russia, which decreased many folds, it's still buying certain volumes of Russian gas coming as LNG. So there are ways for Russia to still be able to sell its gas, but we don't see anything similar to what was at the beginning of this year, when Russia was relying very much on the dependence of the EU on gas in order to reduce or to distract EU from solidarity towards Ukraine.
Thank you. And just one more, if I may. There's been a huge number of displaced people because of the war. I know a lot of men have not been able to leave. I can't remember the exact age group. Was it 18 to 55? I can't remember exactly the age groups that can't leave the country, but a huge number of women have left the country. So have you seen any impact in terms of a kind of a management or a business leader, technician brain drain? And are you expecting anything? What would be the impact of that if there was one?
Unfortunately, the war against Ukraine that Russia started this year, but also the events in Belarus 2 years ago, they have led to a very intense phenomenon of migration from Eastern Europe to the EU and the UK. So I think that this geopolitical instability is creating exactly this kind of fertile soil for brain drain, especially if we take into account the recent partial mobilization that Russia has initiated and how it affected the human resources and the labor, the stability on the labor market within Russia. How many people from IT and other important sectors for the Russian economy have left the country in order to escape the Russian army and the war in Ukraine. So we understand that on the one hand, the war is creating this migration from Russia towards other countries, including Central Asia, but also how the war is obviously creating a lot of humanitarian issues for Ukraine, and how many Ukrainians are still abroad and probably will not be able to come back because of what Russia is doing right now by destroying the Ukrainian critical infrastructure. So there are at least two aspects of the migration issues related to Eastern Europe, and I think that the war is going to create even more migration, including brain drain, that should be in a way tackled adequately by the EU and Western partners in order to make sure that these people are going to return to Ukraine, because Ukraine will need a lot of well-educated population in order to repair the country after the war is over.
Thanks, Dionis, for that. Dionis, is there anything we haven't spoken about that you think is important to mention? I mean, I'd be interested to hear from you just a little bit more about, I mean, you've touched on it, but the fact that the Russian military are not just striking sort of energy infrastructure, they're striking all sorts of different critical infrastructure. It'd be good to get a bit of a rundown from you, just for our listeners, so they can really understand the magnitude of what is being hit and the breadth of what is being hit and what that might mean for the population. What it does mean.
Well, given that the Russian pundits are talking openly about creating epidemiological crisis within Ukraine by striking the sanitation installations, not only the elements critical infrastructure that are producing electricity, but also those elements that are used to clean the water, for canalization, and so on and so forth. It is clear that the intentions of Russia is to make the country inhospitable for the population and to create as much harm as possible, to multiply the crisis that the country is going through in order to draw away the energy, the political attention, the administrative resources from fighting against Russians and from the counteroffensive, which has been successful until now, to other issues that are also very relevant for the resilience, for the societal resilience of the Ukrainians, which is related to exactly preventing the country from falling into epidemiological crisis.
Well, thank you very much for that. Dom, I don't know if you want to comment on any of that, or shall we go to your final few updates?
Well, I will wrap any thoughts there into my final update, please. So shall I go with that now, so you can finish with Dionis, let him have the final word? I just note that so my final thoughts are Russia's attitude to the UK at the moment. So Russia's Foreign Affairs Ministry have said this morning that they are going to summon Britain's ambassador to Moscow over what it says as the involvement of British specialists in the Ukrainian drone strike on the Russia's Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. Now, we think this is in regard to, or we think Russia is holding Britain to blame here, to account here, because of the story that we actually did some months ago of the Royal Navy helping Ukraine's Navy to work with the Remus drone to hunt mines. And we think Russia have taken that and said, there you go, Britain's responsible for this, the drone strike at the weekend. Also, just hold that thought for a moment. Also, today we had a background briefing with a Western official. The Western official said that, amongst other things, said that Russia did not expect to be fighting in Ukraine in the winter, and also said that Putin is, quote, probably better informed now than he was at the beginning, but I suspect it's not completely the unvarnished truth, which I thought was quite interesting. But also, and in relation to my point about the UK, the Western official said, and this was in regard to Nord Stream, said that Kremlin is trying to detract attention with wild stories about the UK. Don't fall for it. So Russia here, we've got the drone strike on Sevastopol. We've got Russia now saying Britain is somehow something to do with Nord Stream. Of course, if you remember, it was Britain behind the plot for the dirty bomb. So this Russia is now sort of looking for external, looking to point the finger externally, which not only tries to race the agenda or lead the narrative on the international front, but also this will play very well inside Russia, especially images of the British ambassador being sort of driven into the to go and see the Russia's foreign minister today for a dressing down. I mean, that will play very well, and it all points to this fortress Russia, fortress Moscow type mentality that Russia is not losing this war against Ukraine. It is losing a war in Ukraine because they're actually fighting Britain and NATO and everybody else. So this is all part of the same narrative. So watch out for how Russian media play this appearance of Britain's ambassador to Moscow later on today, I think, at the Foreign Ministry.
Thanks, Tom. Very quickly, can I just get your thoughts on, we had a story yesterday about this, suspected, alleged Ukrainian strike behind enemy lines in which, on a Russian airbase, in which 2 helicopters were destroyed. You had some thoughts about that. Would you take us through them?
Yeah, okay, briefly, I'm sceptical because they don't need to film themselves doing it. A couple of Ka-52 attack helicopters going up in smoke. I mean, we've seen these kind of things happen before, and Ukraine neither confirms nor denies it. And everyone goes, I bet it was the Ukrainians. That's a very good terrorist attack, partisan attack, or what have you. So they don't need to film themselves doing it to get the sort of international strategic comms win out of it. And also, I'm just slightly sceptical about someone filming themselves doing it. I've only had a walk-on part in all the punch-ups the country decided to get into while I served in the military. But believe me, when things get a little tasty, the last thing on my mind was, have I got my lippy on properly? Is my helmet straight? Because I'm going to be on camera. I mean, I just didn't have the capacity for any of that stuff. So I'm not suggesting that this strike on these helicopters were not by partisans or some kind of fifth columnists within Russia, disgruntled Russian employees, or whatever it was. I just wonder if that film, the film of it, is totally legit. It just seems, if you've got the capacity to take a camera and film yourself doing it while you're there, I mean, well done. You're a better soldier than I ever was. And I don't think they needed to do it. They've got the propaganda win out of the effect. So I'm just a little bit sceptical about the film, but I don't want that to detract from. It looks as if there was some kind of internal action against Russia to destroy these aircraft. But just hold that one out there.
Thank you very much, Dom. And thank you very much, Dionis, for joining us. Dionis, can I just come to you finally? What are your final thoughts? What do you want our listeners, our audience to go away and think about based on what you've said today? And also, what are you going to be looking at in the next few months?
Well, I think that there are at least three major issues that I'm going to follow closely. One is whether Belarus will be playing an important role in the future attacks of Russia against Ukraine, because this is very, very much discussed, and we know that Belarus would be affected because sanctions will follow after such kind of decisions by Lukashenko. But still, we cannot exclude this scenario. Then I'm also curious whether Russia is going to strike the remaining routes of gas supply through Ukraine to Europe. Because we know that critical infrastructure is targeted now, and maybe closer to December, the Russians are going to do that also to the gas infrastructure. This is also an opportunity for them to increase the energy crisis for Ukraine, but also for the rest of Europe. And last but not least, it's also very important to have an eye on how Russia is developing the narrative about the dirty bomb and the use of nukes against Ukraine, because this can be the game changer. Russia understands very well that the world is, especially those who are protesting against the war and are putting pressure on the Western governments to go for negotiations or to convince the Ukrainians to negotiate with Russia, that the nuke story is going to have an impact on this kind of decisions. So these are three topics that I'm going to monitor in the coming weeks.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast by The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. You can also listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, do leave a review, as it helps others find the show. To our listeners on YouTube, for reasons beyond our control, there's sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you do want to hear an episode as soon as possible, it's available on your podcast apps. Please search for Ukraine the Latest on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your preferred app. Check out the Ukraine page on the Telegraph website. As ever, you can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. We are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Claire Hubble.